to adult-like, and I have these in quotation marks, adult-like, mature notions of man's will, prediction, and reason. So again, an evolution from notions of God's will, prophecy, and revelation, immature notions, to mature notions of man's will, prediction, and reason. In the book, The Future of an Illusion, for example, Sigmund Freud describes man's development of the concept of God as emerging out of a need, or a continued need, for a father figure. Secularization thus describes a process through which the secular worldview emerges. A worldview that, just as any other worldview, attempts to explain how the human being came into existence, his reason for existing, and his ultimate fate. While it is true that the adherents of the secular worldview focus their attention on the here and now, there is clearly no shortage of secular explanations for man's creation, they call it evolution, or his ultimate fate, they call it the Big Bang Theory. The emergence of secularism as a dominant worldview in Europe and the West is a direct result of the schism, or the break, between the Roman Catholic Church and science that characterized the Dark Ages. Scientific explanations that were at odds with church doctrine were seen as heretical, and their adherents severely punished, if not put to death. This drove the scientific community underground, where it ultimately developed its own worldview devoid of theological underpinnings. In the Islamic world, however, no such schism took place between religion and science. The seeking of scientific knowledge was seen as an act of worship, and many great religious leaders were scientists as well. Now let's move on to this second question again briefly. How has the Muslim mind become secularized? As the Muslim Ummah sunk into the pit of colonial and neo-colonial domination, it lost its ability to educate its own citizens. Fragmented into artificial nation-states created by the Western colonial masters, a dual educational system was imposed that created a false dichotomy between Islamic and modern, that is, secular, education. The leadership of the newly formed states was drawn from those educated in the secular system, and soon a Western-oriented elite was prepared to administer the affairs of the newly formed nation. A prerequisite for membership in this ruling elite, however, was commitment to Western values, Western education, and the Western worldview. This Westernization of Muslim mind necessarily creates hostility to Islam, since Islam was the dominant ideology of the West's newly conquered foes. The conquering of Muslim lands, however, was not done in the name of Christianity. The motive was material gain and the exploitation of the vast resources possessed by the Ummah. Muslims did not have to be converted to Christianity. It was enough that they simply abandoned Islam. And I'd like to quote a publication of the International Institute of Islamic Thought in terms of this, I guess we would call it a de-Islamization process. And I quote, "The colonialists attacked everything either directly or by their native puppets. The perfection of the Quranic text, the message of the Prophet ﷺ, the veracity of the Sunnah, the comprehensiveness of the Sharia, and the glories of Muslim achievements in culture and civilization were severely denigrated. None of them were spared. The purpose was to inject doubt into the Muslim's confidence in himself, in his ummah, and in his faith and ancestors. The object was to undermine his Islamic consciousness and to subvert his Islamic personality, unquote. Thus we're planting the seeds of secularization in the minds of Muslims throughout the Ummah. Now, can one be both secular and Muslim? The eminent African-American sociologist and historian W.E.B. Du Bois once described the descendants of America's African slaves as having a double consciousness, or two warring souls within one mind. One of these souls longed for Africa, the motherland. The other valued everything European. A similar kind of schizophrenia, or double consciousness, permeates the mind of that individual who calls himself a secular Muslim. What is a secular Muslim? If it is a person that says that they believe in both secularization and Islam, then that individual is either out of contact with reality, what is called schizophrenia in the Western world, or has given the implications of this label very little thought. The logical inconsistencies in the label are clear. If one believes in secularization, then the Quran can only be viewed as an example of a, quote, supernatural myth, unquote, and its laws as, quote, the religious determination of the symbols of cultural integration, unquote. One cannot believe in the disenchantment of nature and also believe that Allah created the world and placed the human being in it. One cannot believe in the desacralization of politics and also believe that the Quran provides the parameters for Islamic government. And one cannot believe in the deconsecration of values and believe that the Quran is an eternal guidebook for human moral behavior. Therefore, one cannot simultaneously believe in secularization and Islam. Thus, it is impossible to be both secularist and Muslim. The secularist believes in the supremacy of man's will, the Muslim in the supremacy of Allah's will. The secularist plays loosely with the quaint phrase, no religion in politics. The Muslim makes no distinction between religion and politics. The secularist is a firm believer in moral relativism. The Muslim is a firm believer in the supreme moral authority of the Quran and the Sunnah of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The secularist and the Muslim cannot peacefully coexist in the same mind. Secularism and Islam cannot both be true. And what one believes to be true establishes the parameters of one's behavior. Consequently, the parameters of behavior will either be secular or Islamic. The drinking of alcohol, the eating of pork, sexual intercourse outside of marriage, homosexuality, the payment of interest. The list could go on and on of those behaviors that reflect value differences between Islam and secularism. The secularist wants to be free to satisfy his own will, while the Muslim wants to be free to submit to the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Again, the secularist and the Muslim cannot peacefully coexist in the same mind. This is not to suggest that Muslims and secularists cannot peacefully coexist, although some would argue that point. In a world with a population approaching 5 billion, over 1 billion of whom are Muslim, this peaceful coexistence is a must. Both groups must recognize that there will be places where Muslims are predominant and places where secularists are predominant. Each must recognize that certain societies will be governed according to the parameters of each worldview. I think we all recognize that Muslims are not in a position to impose Sharia in a land where they are an extreme numerical minority. But likewise, secularists cannot deny Muslims the right to establish Sharia within the context of an Islamic state in lands where they are clearly predominant. What is the methodology for desecularizing the Muslim mind? Once it becomes apparent to the Ummah that secularization is in fact de-Islamization, the converse becomes equally obvious. Islamization is desecularization. Since the essence of mind is the individual's knowledge filtered through his worldview, then the Islamization of that knowledge should result in Islamized, desecularized mind.